Hi there, I'm Delba, developer advocate for next.js, and I'm here today to talk about React with...
Hi, I'm Andrew. I work on React. I've been on the React team for about 6 years now, and I've worked on things like Suspense and concurrent rendering and hooks alongside Sebastian here.
And I'm Sebastian. I've worked on React for the last decade or so, providing a lot of the technical direction.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. I want to start off by asking you a simple question, which is, how do you think about React?
To me, it's all about components and composability. How do we take things, all the things that it takes to build really great user experiences, really great UIs, really great websites and applications, and provide a way to author those experiences in a way that feels the most natural and direct, while also allowing for really great performance out of the box. And I don't think it's really that important ultimately if you call it a framework or a library or whatever. You can use whatever term kind of helps you think about it the best. The way I think about it personally is that it's not about any particular NPM package. It's not any particular implementation, or even it's not about even use state or use effect or any API like that. It's all about providing a way to author UIs, user experiences, applications in a way that feels natural and in a way that is composable. I think that's really maybe the crux of what makes something feel Reacty is, can you compose it? And the classic example of this is components, but of course you also have hooks, which provide composable units of functionality for your app. So, on the React team, we have a very strong cultural sense of things that feel Reacty, and composability is maybe the most important one. How do you think about that, Seb?
Yeah, I think it's, in a way, it's kind of like we're figuring out what all the details are that goes into building a UI and what goes into building a good UX. And then we kind of distill that into concepts that are repeatable, and we kind of figure out okay, here's data fetching, here's what a boundary for a component, here's suspense or concepts like that, or animations, or and then we take that and we create bounds for others to iterate on. So we create a little component, we create a boundary, we create concepts that others can build UI using those concepts.
Yeah.
And then we create this ability to compose them together. So there's a lot of focus for us on how do we enable others to build these building blocks without necessarily even coordinating with each other.
Yeah.
And in a sense, maybe React is all about the component, just as an idea. And all of the parts of React are, how can we make things component-y? How can we take things like data fetching or animations or all of these different things that you need to build a UI and add them to the component model.
Yeah.
But we're not obsessed with one in particular technology aspect of it. The component itself is not, we're not trying to force that into any possible abstraction. It's more the concept of componentization, of being able to work with many different colleagues across different companies through open source or between teams internally. And componentization is a way to achieve that. And so we just find where that breaks down and what we can do to fix that to still build good user experiences.
Yeah, yeah. So you could say components are the core of React, right? The building blocks, the Lego blocks. But I feel, and I think I'm speaking for the community here as well, is that I would say probably the past 2 years, it's been more than just components. For example, with the IRC that you posted on async and await and promises and suspense. Can you talk more a little bit about that and how that kind of like fits into your like image
Yeah.
of React?
A lot of the features that we're building are finding ways to, like hooks or like server components, to take things that used to force you to break outside of the component model and integrate them directly into React itself or directly into the component model. So data fetching, for example.
Yeah.
Classic example of something that until quite recently, for most people, it forced you to break outside of the nice model of React where you can just access things directly inside of your UI functions. And you'd have to subscribe to a store. You'd have to set up this external thing.
Yeah.
State management is another example of this. Like, oh, I have an external store that manages my state, and I've got to tunnel into that in order to use it. So a lot of the stuff we've been working on the last year, 5 years, decade, has been how do we solve this problem of making the data layer feel like it's just another part of your component
Yes.
that's as easy to compose as state or as anything else that you deal with.
Yeah, so it's like taking all these other things that you need to consider when you're building UI and then making sure that they feel cohesive with the rest of your components. Now, talking about components, recently we've been playing a lot with server components. So for those who are watching and who might not be too familiar with it, what exactly are server components? And I guess how would you like come up with the idea of server components?
Well, a server component is just a component that runs on the server. But there's been things like SSR that also runs on the server, and it's a different concept. But I think stepping back, the way I think about it is like ignore SSR for now and think about just client navigations. What is the best way we can make a seamless experience throughout your application, not just arriving to it, but throughout your application. And we realized that there's some limitations to what we could do to achieve this like component model and a data fetching model with just doing that on the client. Kind of figured out what the API we wanted to look like and how to compose them and how to describe your experience with things like suspense boundaries. But we didn't really have the right performance, and we didn't feel like you still had to do a lot of extra work to get there. And we took a lot of inspiration from GraphQL Relay that has solved a lot of those issues, but there was still something missing to get to that developer experience we really wanted to achieve, which is like you had to create this extra abstraction layer. Maybe you didn't, so maybe someone else did, but it became this split, this artificial split where you have to introduce a boundary. And we wanted to be able to, and we realized that it was also often not sufficient, because in those environments you still had to break out under certain conditions. You sometimes have to create a new artificial denormalized field. You have to conditionally request one query and another in some conditions. And now that wasn't as seamless as we would like. And so I tried to figure out what could we do to make that more fit with just a React model and just the same component model. And it turned out I had already had a similar idea for a different use case years before, which was to run separate trees in separate processes, but on the client. And we tried to do this for parallelism purposes. It turned out to not be a great idea because the overhead running two processes on the client was just not worth it for that use case. But I realized that the same thing could just work on the server. We could just move some of the tree to the server. And then that has the full power of the server, which includes things like low latency access to data, which avoids the waterfall problems. You can access things that have different security models, like databases directly. You can ad hoc request data from a fetch if you need to, or from a database. You can combine these two things. You can create an ORM layer. You can create a security model layer, all within that model because now you're in the kind of a secure sandbox. So there was just a lot of things that fell into place once we had this server component model. And then it took a long time to iterate on what exactly that would look like. Went into various designs, co-location, having multiple different part and client server in the same file. We iterated on file extensions, various annotations, special syntax. And it took a while to come up with this model, but we think what we came up with is it's a good balance of constraints. And there's some parts that are a little bit annoying to learn, but we think it's worth it because once you learn that one thing, you just unlock a completely new ecosystem.
What I really liked about that recap that Seb gave of kind of the evolution of where these ideas came from is that you notice there are a lot of different inputs into what Seb was saying, a lot of inputs into the final design that became server components. And it's not just performance. It's not just like the DX angle. It's not just like how do we make these things composable. It was a little bit of all of them. And then you go through all these iterations and you come out with a result that we think in the end doesn't really feel like a compromise on any of those axes. Like if you actually look at the process for how we got there, that felt a little bit messy, but in the end you get a result that seems inevitable.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like how should developers go about thinking about server components versus client components?
I'm not going to say there won't be a little bit of a learning curve for folks. There is some knowledge that you have to acquire for like, okay, how do I declare that this particular component is going to run on the client now? You add a use client directive in that file, and then it runs on the client. In a way, it's really just as simple as that. Like you might want to know a little bit more for what's going on behind the scenes, but when you actually use it, I don't think it will be confusing. I think there'll be a little adjustment, but it feels very natural.
Yeah. The way that I kind of like to see it is as a front-end developer working with SPAs, you kind of just tended to ignore the server. Like you didn't really think much about it unless you had to do some back-end stuff. Whereas I think this is going to like help a lot of front-end developers to really start thinking about the server because it's a very crucial part of your application.
Well, yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think it also illustrates a point though, which is that, and this is what I was trying to touch on with the constraints we don't realize are constraints. I think if you're a front-end developer, I'm going to put that in quotes for a second.
Yeah.
And you, especially if you're on a team or in an organization that has very strict separation between front-end and back-end rules, you might take for granted today that, oh, I have an API, someone built an API for me.
And you just call it.
And I'm just going to call it.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to think about like the performance of that. Or like I didn't have to design the API endpoints. I'm just magically going to have access to it. And so from that person's perspective, I can see how maybe you just said like, oh, now the person can think about the server. Maybe they don't want to think about the server. So I can see how maybe from that perspective, you're giving me more to do. But if you think about it from like the global perspective of what does it take to build an app, it's actually way more convenient to do it this way. Because if you look at it used to be two different people had to build a feature. You'd have to build the API and then you'd have to hand it off to another person to build the front end of it. Now, one person or two people working together can build the entire feature, likely in a single component, without that artificial layer in between. And if you look at the aggregate complexity, it's actually way simpler and way less confusing than this previous world where you had to pass it off like a baton.
Without the additional tooling or languages that you need to go to the server. That's really cool.
So, touching on an aspect of that, you're gonna come at this from different angles depending on how you used to work. And depending on how you used to work, you can use this more or less. Like we talk a lot about server components now because it's kind of new, but it doesn't mean that for everyone it permeates everything. If you're building an app that is, or even maybe you don't even call it an app, it's like a site, it's like a marketing page. Maybe you want to think about this being more of a server first. It's just providing a structure of your page, but it doesn't mean that it has to be all server. Like it's perfectly fine to have client components in this model as well. They're not escape hatches, they're part of the whole model. And on the flip side, it might be that you actually need a lot of client components because you have a particularly interactive, low latency app with everything going on the client. But you might still use a little bit of a server. Maybe it's a settings page in the background. Maybe it's an about page in the background. Maybe it's the server provides the scaffolding for which A/B test group this user is in. And it doesn't have to permeate everything. Like you just use it a little bit or you use it a lot. It kind of depends on your situation and where you're coming from.
But it's really just another tool in your toolbox, if you want to think about it that way. Like you don't have to move stuff. It's just there, and it happens to be really convenient, and you're going to want to use it. But it's not an extra concern. It's an extra tool.
Yeah, exactly. It's a non-breaking change. You can choose to move things when you're able to. Yeah. So when it comes to, I guess, moving things to the server and doing more things on the server, as you mentioned, server first, how should we think about the interaction between the server and the client? I guess what I'm asking is, how exactly do server components and client components work? I know earlier, Seb, you mentioned about the trees. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that so that we can have a better understanding of how things flow from the server to the client?
Yeah, so the model is anytime you kind of need data, you're doing a request to the server. And I'm going to start assuming that we're already on the client and wait with SSR for now. Because a lot of this is about optimizing that cross-page experience where you're already on a page and you're consuming that page and you're interacting with that page. And if I'm navigating to somewhere, it could be that this fetch is a preload or prefetch or pre-render for the next page. Then we're going to do a fetch to the server. The server is then going to load the data that we need, which you can just use in your components. And that will execute this server components down. Once that hits a client component, we have to serialize that to send to the server. We need to create instructions, which is basically just JSON instructions. And as we're doing that, we might discover that one of the properties of that client component, which would typically be named children, but it could be anything. It could be a title or header property that you pass to a client component. If that also takes the server component, we have to optimistically render it on the server because that might now be needed on the client. It might not be because the client component can conditionally render this, like maybe it says show more and that's content. But we really want to avoid those extra round trips when that happens. We want when you click that show more to be active. So therefore we also render the server components on the server, even though it's a child of the client component. And
So just to make sure we understand, you have your server components and your client components, and they're interleaved in the tree. So you resolve all the server components on the server first. And the client components?
And the client components get a placeholder in the instruction. So it's basically turning into a new tree of client components. You kind of resolved all of the server components out of the tree, and now you're left with a tree of client components. And that's what we send to the client. Then the client takes that and just renders it with React. And that lets you have both of these interleaved trees. All of this happens streamingly though, which is a term coined by Andrew, which means that every piece of these gets sent to the client as they happen, which means that these are not two separate steps. This is not a waterfall of do all the server stuff and then do all the client stuff. They're actually executing interleaved as well, but they just happen on two different worlds.
That's interesting. Can you talk more about that?
Well, one thing I'll say is that the nice thing about all of this is you don't have to think about it for the most part. It's just how it happens to work. And I think that was that's been a really exciting thing about all of these various kind of insights and innovations that have led up to this streaming server components architecture. But the question that you can ask yourself is, it seems a little silly that every single time I want to access a piece of data, I have to design a loading state. And this is still kind of how it is if you use like a hook-based API today. Is every time I want to access some piece of data from a server, again, this is like with existing like hook-based solutions for data fetching, I have to design a loading state. Because what do I do if the data is not there? So the API usually is like use, fetch from server, whatever it's called. And then you get like a little tuple back, which is loading, and then the actual data if it's there.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't matter like if I don't want a spinner or a loading state there. I've got to do something. I got to show something there. So what ends up happening is every single time you want to access data, you design a loading state. But it turns out like you're doing that all over the place. Like everywhere is accessing data, right? So you get this, I think people have referred to it as like spin-a-get-in or, too many spinners all over the place. By accident, not because you thought a spinner should go there, but because you had to render something. So I think the original idea, and Seb can correct me, the original like insight that kind of made Suspense click, even before we had a name for it, was you should be able to define where the placeholders go in your app, the loading screens go in your app, separately from where the data is accessed. So that idea kind of came first. Then we had a whole saga of, okay, well, that's how like the user experience part of it can be designed, but where does the actual data come from? And so on and so forth. That led to server components. But that was like a really key milestone, and it led to things like the streaming server renderer, because Suspense is a very powerful component to like how that works. It led to things like, once we had this declarative way to define loading states, it raised some interesting opportunities for us. We're like, well, now React can decide when to show a loading state versus when not to. How should it do that? Should it always show a loading state if the data isn't there? Can it throttle the appearance sometimes? Is it sometimes preferable for it to block the transition as opposed to immediately showing a loading state? We had a lot of iterations on that. A lot of feedback that we got from folks working on Relay and folks at Facebook at the time. Many different iterations similar to the saga with server components. But I think what we ended up with was, once again, like the best APIs that we try to come up with is that when you use Suspense, it's just going to work. When you use Suspense, you're going to get loading states at the moment that you want them, and React is going to know how to intelligently avoid certain avoid certain loading states that lead to a bad user experience. And you're not going to have to think about it as the application developer. You're just going to design where the loading states go, and React will figure everything else out for you.
Yeah. So I guess the thing about Suspense as well is that it's not just about the loading state or telling React, okay, this relies on data. You also have an aspect of streaming as well, right?
Right.
Which I think in our industry, people don't really implement streaming that much because it's very hard to do so. So can you tell me a bit more about how does it relate back to streaming from the server?
So what React lets you do, for example, is you can start rendering that when you have the JS and produce the result, wait for that result to be displayed until you have the CSS, and then display them all both at once. So you're cutting down the total lifetime of the application by parallelizing as much as possible. So that's one aspect to it. Even if your user experience is nowhere different, streaming just lets you do more things in parallel. You can parallelize all the work you do on the client, you can parallelize your data streams, you can start sending it earlier, you can parallelize. And a similar example is you fetch all your data on the server, and then you wait to send it until you have all the data. And then you have to wait on each of those bytes kind of going across the internet through the internet tubes, one by one. And then when you get them on the client, you're now going to do the next step. Instead of doing all of those things as steps, we just interleave them. We do everything as early as we can, and that just shortens the total span of the experience. So that's like one with the first thing with streaming. Then what we can do is that we can change the user experience to not show everything at once, but show things in piecemeal. But
With
that's
suspense.
a secondary, with suspense.
Yeah.
And so you add the suspense boundary to say, actually, I'm okay with showing this in 2 stages, or 3 stages, or however you want to design that loading sequence. And then we get shortened the time to display for that first stage even more.
If you're hearing all these details, some of you are thinking, oh, that's really cool. Some of you might be going, oh my goodness, why is it so complicated? Why are you doing all this stuff? We should go back to a simpler time. But it is simpler for you who is using
And
it,
for the user.
for the person enjoying the magic trick.
Yeah.
And then we have fun too because we like building that stuff. But ultimately, you're not supposed to think about how it works. That's the goal. You shouldn't have to think about how it works.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. So another thing as well to do with suspense is we often hear the term suspense for data fetching. What exactly do we mean by that?
And I'm going to be really careful how I describe this because I don't want it to come off flippantly, but like in a lot of ways, server components is suspense for data fetching. That's what that is. We're not calling it that anymore, but that is like our first clash. Like this is the solution we think for the best way to compose data requirements into your app. I think nowadays some people will say that and they might have a different idea of what it means. They might think, oh, we want like a built-in, I'll use an example. There's a really popular React library today called React Query. And some people think that, oh, suspense for data fetching will just be like a built-in React query. I think if we ever call something suspense for data fetching, it won't be exactly like that. It'll be something more inspired by server components. But to give like a high-level answer, at least this is the way I think about it. Like suspense for data fetching is server components. That's what it is.
So I think server components is the main way we think about it for the data fetching. I think we will explore other types of built-in data fetching, for example, offline first support, synchronized data as well. But there's something in between there. If you don't want to run a server or you have some particular constraint that you cannot run a server in this environment and you want to do it, you can still use server component for static parts of the page, but you might still have some data. And that data, you can use a Jamstack model where some of the data is fetched on the client, some of it is just statically provided. And we want to make that fit into the same API as server components. I'm not really sure we're calling it, like maybe data components is like a more thing. Data components is like a server component, but on the client. But it's the same programming model. So we want to extend that. We think of that more as a de-opt of what you would have done if you did a server component, rather than a primary thing that you would strive to use.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different features of React and how they work together. But there is something that was announced quite recently as well, which is actions. Can you tell me more about actions in React and also how does it tie in with the rest of the architecture?
Yeah, so actions is a very exciting feature. And it actually starts, you can start by thinking it as a client-only feature. It doesn't necessarily have to do with server components because it's just a more convenient way to utilize forms that already exist in the browser in a pattern that was already very common. And we're just making it easier to have it built in. But also building on this notion of composability, we also expect the ecosystem to build their own sources of actions. You can build a custom button that takes an action. You can build a date picker that causes an action when you select a date picker. It's not only for forms. And you can produce an action that does something on the client, or even more excitingly, you can move the action to the server. And it fits seamlessly into the server components model. And once we do that, we can do a lot of different things with that action, because an action will often be a mutation. It will cause a change to the UI. And by by having that on the server, we can actually invalidate the caches that we have on the server. And that means you can actually cache more, right? Because the problem with caches is you have to make up a time-based and you have to figure out when you're going to invalidate it. But by making it very easy to just invalidate those caches server side, and that's something that you can't do client side. We already know like we can invalidate caches, we can refresh things on the client, but that doesn't refresh it from another user. So now because we're on the server, we can also refresh our caches. We can recompute our ISR. Mm-hmm. But because of server components and more importantly, React reconciliation, we can send you the new updated result of the page given that new data. And that is something that is kind of a new shift because I think what we used to do a lot is have normalized data storage. What I mean by that is like you have a user and an ID and a name, and there can only be one name on the client. And then you have to update that on the client when that changes. You have to then figure out where that's used everywhere, and you have to figure out if that's a derived field. The model just becomes so much simpler with the server action plus the server components because you just refresh the data. And because React reconciliation, it doesn't matter how that refreshed. It will just preserve the state and the system of the page, but just as if it was new data. So it doesn't throw away anything. It doesn't cause the screen to go blank and come back. It doesn't close your chat windows. It doesn't stop your video from playing while you're doing this. It kind of just works with the client-side experience, but together with the server. And so we think that that's going to be a really powerful primitive to build on.
What's great about that is too, is like the way, if you listen to the description, it sounds a lot, at least the first part does. The first part sounds a lot like a multi-page app, or like what people like about a multi-page app is, oh, you just click a thing, you do a full page navigation, renders a new thing. But the point Seb made about, you know, it is that, but it's way better because when you do that navigation, you're not going to lose the state of the things that were on the previous screen as well. There's a really great demo that, did you build this demo? There's a next demo that illustrates this really well. Whoever did, great job. That illustrates this, I think, really clearly, that you're having your cake and you're eating it too. You're getting the things that people like about multi-page apps without sacrificing all of the really great things we've come to love about single-page apps, client-driven apps over the last decade.
Wow. So there's a lot in React that I think we all will have to learn and get used to.
Is it exciting though, or is it overwhelming?
It is exciting when you see the potential and what you can do with it. As you mentioned earlier, it's not just a performance thing. There's a lot of other benefits, which kind of leads me to my next question is, do you have any recommendations for people learning these new features? And it could be, for example, patterns of how they can think about building applications with React?
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest advice, and the reason I asked you if you were overwhelmed is because I think some people are feeling a little overwhelmed. Like, especially maybe with this conversation, we always find it difficult to modulate like how technical we should go. Because again, at the end of the day, you're not supposed to think about any of this. Not you in particular. I mean, in general, people using React or Next are not really supposed to think about this. If they have to think about it too much, it means we probably didn't do our job well enough, right? I mean, it's really interesting to talk about. Like, we could sit here and talk about it for 10 hours and be really great. But we don't want it to be overwhelming. We want it to be exciting, and we want it to be, we want you to be excited by the potential of what you can build on top when you don't have to think about all this stuff anymore. It's like, oh, great, I don't have to worry about hydration costs because React does all those magic tricks to make it just work. So what was your question again? I forgot now. I got all excited on my soapbox. Oh, advice, yeah.
Yes,
my advice would be, first of all, don't get overwhelmed. And then secondly, especially if you've been doing this for a while, if you've been building on the web for a while, if you're building with React for a while, try to forget what you know. Try to forget what you know and approach things with like a fresh perspective.
Like a junior dev's perspective?
Yes, exactly. Or maybe someone who, I mean, I think we often think not just of junior devs, but like maybe people who aren't even programmers. Like they're I've met a lot of these types of folks. They are designers, they have a smattering of CSS knowledge, and then they look over to their colleague and see the code that they're writing, and are like, oh, I could do that. I know HTML pretty well. That doesn't look that different. From that person's perspective, I think it might be even easier for that person to learn server components than it might be for someone, like me, who's who's got like a decade of web and UI baggage rattling around in my
Technical
head.
debt.
Yeah, technical debt, and all these preconceived notions about like what is a constraint versus what isn't. We brought up the hydration examples. A lot of people think of that as like, oh, that's never going to work. You can never make hydration work because it blocks the main thread for too long and it delays interactions. Well, we made it work. So you just need to abandon some of these preconceived notions. And if you approach it from that mindset, I think it'll be a lot less overwhelming and a lot more, dare I say, liberating, in the sense of all this stuff that I used to get in my way is now actually supporting me and making my life easier as I focus on the things I actually want to focus on to make my app or my website as good as it can possibly be.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And I definitely agree. It's easier to think about it when you actually come with it with like fresh eyes. It really does help. What about you, Seb? Do you have any advice?
Well, I'm excited to see what new stuff people come up with, because like with hooks, the core principle of hooks is the composability. It's not like the easiest way to use data use effect, whatever. It's the custom whatever hook. That's what opens up a new industry, a new ecosystem, and a new wave of inspiration, a new wave of creative solutions. And I think that's what I'm most excited about with service components, is just explore things you built before. Try to build a new framework. Don't like necessarily port what you've done before. Can rethink how much needs to be client. How would you design a form in this world where now they have new building blocks? Some of the assumptions you might have done in the past no longer apply, because now you can compose server actions. You can rely on the selector hydration. You can do your data fetching, and you can publish that from the NPM and share it with your friends and colleagues. And there's just the way you build these things are going to be different. And there's some hurdles in the upgrade path and the early adopters, but that's going to be the really exciting thing for me, is like seeing how that ecosystem grows in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I think that will be very exciting. And on that note, how do you see React evolving in the next couple of years?
So there's nothing really in particular. I mean, I could list off, like, I really want us to get better, like, built-in animations and things like that.
Yes.
I think that would be really cool to move animations into the component model the way we're doing now with data fetching. But yeah, it's not really any particular thing. I'm just excited about that general idea of making things more composable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're only kind of halfway there with the data loading. Like, we can make data loading even easier. Like, we have the building blocks now to be able to pull in different libraries, and I'm not sure if we're the ones to build it, or if there's a third party that builds it, or how we compose these things. But I think there's just so much more to make data management even easier to bring into this model. And I think one focus to bring this is going to be the mobile aspect, and more of the offline first aspect, more of a client first. We can make that even easier, but still sticking to this model and taking advantage of it where it makes sense.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. It really helped, I think, and I hoped it has helped clarify all these new features for a lot of people. So yeah, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks for talking to us. That was really nice.